Welcome everyone to this week's edition of the Commercial Real Estate 101 Meetup Group. Excited to see all your guys' names primarily, I guess, but also some faces. Today, we actually have a phenomenal guest, Lucas Lindsey. He's actually a good buddy of mine from college. He is in the commercial real estate industry out in Phoenix and is a development manager for VENTURE Projects, which is a pretty sizable and really cool developer that's doing some really neat things in the space over in Phoenix. And they specialize primarily in adaptive reuse projects. So I thought it'd be awesome for him to come by and explain what exactly that means, and then explain a little bit more on top of that about some of the projects they've worked on and how they took these projects from starting point to finalizing everything and making it a profitable project for all those involved. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and hand it off to Lucas so he can explain a little bit more about the concept. So Lucas.
Thanks, Raphael. Appreciate it. Hey, everybody. Good morning to those in my time zone. Good afternoon to those in the East. As Raphael said, I'm Lucas Lindsey. I'm development manager with VENTURE Projects. Very excited to be here to talk about a topic that is near and dear to my heart and means a ton to me, which is bringing new life to old buildings and saving historic structures and revitalizing neighborhoods by taking what are vacant spaces and turning them into people places, that are a unique experience and where people love to hang out. My background in real estate has been primarily through adaptive reuse projects, often commercial, restaurant, retail, but we've expanded into hotel and other things. I'll talk a little bit about some of the projects we've done. But first, Raphael, can everyone see the slides here if they're on my screen? Just want to have the obligatory check.
Sure. Yeah. Go ahead and project those if you'd like. And for those of you guys who are listening, so we will also be posting this as a podcast format. So Lucas is kind of going to describe some of the things that he is going to be talking about on the slide. So don't worry about it. We'll be able to describe everything accordingly. So
right on. Thank you. So the title of this is How Buildings Learn, because some of what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to borrow a little bit from one of my favorite books, which to be sort of the Bible of adaptive reuse and value add, and the way that's thinking strategically about how buildings change. And that's a book by Stuart Brand. So you'll see some things in here where I'm pulling quotes and ideas and applying that to some of the projects I've seen. But so I got started with VENTURE Projects actually in 2010. Just to give a little background, I was an undergrad student at Arizona State. I was in a fraternity with Raphael. That's how we met and became buddies. And at that time, I was studying urban planning. I thought I wanted to be a city manager, work in city management. But this internship opportunity with the upstart development firm came through the listserv, and this was in the depths of the recession. There were really no job opportunities for planning students. And so I was jumping at anything I could for a summer internship. I walked into a coffee shop in downtown Phoenix, one of the first times riding the light rail from Tempe, exploring a whole new world. And I found these guys there, and they asked me what I wanted to do in 5 years. I told them I'd probably be in a grad student program for city management. And one of the principals looked at me and said, it would sounds like it'd be a lot more fun if you were working with us on redoing buildings. And 12 years later, he was right. I've had a great time. I actually did go to grad school, so I did a hiatus for 6 years in Florida. But a few years ago, boomerang back to Arizona, and in the early 2010s, and now for the last 3-4 years, have worked with VENTURE Projects, and it's just been kind of a rocket ship ride and a total blast, and got a lot of exposure to value add and very entrepreneurial strategies for real estate development, often taking vacant, distressed assets and turning them into places that people love to hang out. So it's just been a great opportunity. And I want to talk a little bit more today about my perspective that I've gained from that. So what is adaptive reuse, just to kick it off? To me, I like to think of it as the ongoing change of style, culture, economics that expresses itself through buildings. So buildings are these sort of empty vessels that are subject to a myriad of social, economic, whatever cultural forces at any given time, natural forces even too, and how they adapt and react to that is an open question. And when you see a building go from one use to the other, it's representative of all sorts of changes that are impetus for that. And I think it's fun to think about taking a building that was designed for, in a vacuum for one use, and then decades later, attempting to convert it to a new use. It's a big challenge. It takes a lot of hard work, but if you're able to pull it off, what you can create are very differentiated, valuable assets that people experience and taste, touch, feel, and live in differently than otherwise sort of commodity projects. And as a result, you can have returns that reflect unique outcomes, and you can have great upside. But as I'm going to talk about, there's also a lot of risks involved and things you have to navigate in order to get to the finish line. And rather too than just a textbook definition, I thought I'd open with a brief story about a property that I was a part of in Florida to give you just an illustrated version of what adaptive reuse is through the eyes of a real project. And this is an abandoned gas station property in Tallahassee, Florida. As I said, I was in grad school for a time at Florida State.
Go Knowles.
Yeah, go Knowles, go Brett. There he is. And I really enjoyed that program. And after I graduated, I was working in Tallahassee, running a co-working space in a business incubator, and drove by this building all the time. Myself and a couple of guys that ran the incubator with me, Jake Kiker, Michael Wyden, and those guys became my partners. And this was listed on the market, had a sign out front. We ended up putting an offer on this vacant gas station. Had no idea what we were going to do with it. Had to figure it out. Offer was accepted, and then we had to come up with the money and the plan. So this was an incredible experience. There's a guy named John Anderson who works in development in Atlanta and is a part of founding the Incremental Development Alliance. If you're not familiar with that, definitely look that up. It's a great group for teaching people how to get into small scale real estate development. But he calls these buildings somebody oughtas, which is the building that you drive by every day, that's in your neighborhood or in your city, that you're always saying somebody ought to put a restaurant in there, somebody ought to do this, somebody ought to do that. That was this kind of building, an old mid-century gas station with the beautiful kind of roof flare, that architecture that appealed to us. And we just believed this could be something better. We went through a fun very bootstrap process that I think is replicable to some people who are getting involved for the first time, or maybe early in their career. But this is an abandoned building. We brought out generators. We advertised on Meetup, Facebook, etc., with friends and friends of friends. And we had what we called a get together. We programmed some live music. We programmed some things with local artists and street artists. And we just got people together with a food truck. And the whole idea was to start doing these series of events to do community outreach, really public participation, but through a very informal process. And we started engaging with neighbors, getting ideas for what the building could be, bubbling up interest from potential operators. So all this became a sort of bootstrap marketing and outreach strategy. Frankly, we were just kind of having fun. We knew there was some strategy behind it, but it ended up paying off in ways that we didn't expect, with connections that we didn't expect. So we had local street artists come in and decorate and do a pop-up gallery. We had this great event with the artists, some street artists called Battle of the Boards. And they showed up, and we had these sheets of plywood that were painted white, and they were given a theme, which was knockout that night. And they had 1 hour to paint whatever they wanted based on the theme of the night. And so that was cool. All that was just happening in the background of the event. We also set out these boards called "I Wish This Was" boards, and we collected people's ideas with Sharpies, 8.5, 11 sheets of plywood. So it's pretty straightforward. It was low key, but people loved it. And I think the response was really great. And we got a ton of ideas with such a diversity of people that showed up. And I was really proud of what came out of that. And through that and through our connections at the incubator, we connected with a local restaurant operator, local architect, and a local builder. And over the course of 2.5 years, took longer than we wanted, but we were able to reposition this vacant gas station, really peel back the structure, as you can see here, and then bring it back to new life. And it's a great indoor-outdoor bar space now, and bar and event space in Tallahassee. And we also have a small food operator who does gourmet mac and cheese. And he actually was a very popular food truck operator in Tallahassee. And this was his first brick and mortar. So you can go there and get your gourmet mac and cheese and a beer and have a good time. And it's just been a great space that's really taken what was a vacant, dead corner and brought new life to it. And it's kid friendly, family friendly. That's been a real key to success there for us. It's heavily programmed by the operator, which I think is key. Programming and is a new form of marketing and outreach these days, and really drives revenue to food and beverage operators. So this is an example of a great event they do called Drag Queen Bingo. And it's very popular and people love to come out for it. So this is an example of a project that I participated in. I think I was probably 26, 27 when that started. Really, I was able to have that opportunity because I had two great partners that had a little more track record. And I do believe that having the right team and having the right partners who fill in gaps and are strong where you're weak is really key to some of these projects, because it takes a village and it takes a team to get a complicated adaptive reuse project done, because not everyone's going to know everything. So you need great perspective from people with construction background, design background, finance background, and you really need to build out that well-rounded team. And I benefited from great partners and was able to have that experience. So that's an example of adaptive reuse project, and learned a lot from it. And I've come to believe a few things through those experiences about adaptive reuse and doing a lot of reading and reflecting on it. I want to share those with you today, and then give you one example of a project we did in Phoenix, a complicated adaptive reuse through VENTURE Projects. In Central Phoenix, we took 2 mid-century office buildings and converted them to a boutique hotel. And I had the privilege of being a part of that project. Would love to share that one with you, and then have some discussion, Q&A, etc. We can do follow-ups on any of the projects. I can be as transparent as I can remember on how deals came together, partnership structures, numbers, that sort of thing, but I'm happy to talk more about those. So 3 things I've come to believe about adaptive reuse. First is that a building is never finished. The buildings are, in Stuart Brand in his book, How Buildings Learn, says that the word building contains the double reality. And so it is at one time an act, a verb of building something, but also that which has already been built. So it's an interesting truism that buildings are never static. They either are in a state of some sort of state of decay if they're not being taken care of, or rejuvenation and reuse. And they're always changing in a variety of ways, day to day, week to week, year to year, decade to decade. In his book, he gives this example of these 2 townhouses. They found these are drawings from 1857 of 2 historic row homes in New Orleans. These are the same 2 buildings later in 1993. And it's an interesting A/B test or case-by-case study to show you that after every building is put into use, they then are subject to the whims of the people who use them, the market that's exerting forces on them, the people who own them, and preferences and things change over time. And so you can see the 2 buildings that started the same, both managed to live because they kept themselves useful over the period of 150 years, but they grew and changed in different ways. Their architecture was expressed in different ways. Their use and program and square footage changed in different ways. So it's interesting to see that, buildings, they take all these different forking paths, and no building is ever static and finished. I became sort of fascinated with this idea and got obsessed with Circle K mid-century retail stores in Phoenix. And I was interested in seeing how buildings changed through the lens of these buildings. There was hundreds of these built and proliferated in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s in Phoenix. And there's still over 170 some that remain today. And I went through a process of cataloging these buildings and seeing how their uses has changed. And I think they're an interesting illustration of how buildings are subject to different ways of changing. And this is the only best photo I could find of a mid-century Circle K, but there were these simple rectangular boxes with long roof overhangs, glue lamp beams, sort of indicative of mid-century style. And if you drive all around Phoenix, you see a bunch of buildings like this, but they're no longer Circle Ks because the Circle K business model over the years has changed. They moved to gas station and selling fuel. They moved to hard corners instead of mid blocks. And so as Circle K's business model changed, the type of building and structure they needed changed. As a result, and after going through bankruptcy, they released hundreds of these back onto the market. So it created an interesting case study in adaptive reuse. And these buildings have been, because they're so adaptable, largely kept and saved and reused. And so here's a variety of ways they've been reused in Phoenix. This one still reflects the look of the original Circle K's. It hasn't been changed that much, but it's a flower shop. This is an example of a meat and food market in South Phoenix, very similar, hasn't been changed that much. But then you start to see different ways that companies' business models, their marketing plans change buildings. And to the extent that buildings are able to accommodate this, they're more likely to be saved or reused. So this is more of a corporate tenant put in one of these. They wanted to announce themselves with better signage. Then you start to see mom and pops take these buildings over. This is an old Circle K. That overhang has been hidden by a new fascia. This is now a comedy store, Bridget's Last Laugh, a bar and a comedy venue in Phoenix. Here's a funny one where they punched a hole through the side and it became a drive-through liquor store, and put up a stucco addition on the roof overhang. And so it's just, again, all these divergent paths. This is one in South Phoenix where they cut the overhang off completely, and because they don't appreciate mid-century architecture, and it became a place to get your tires aligned, right? So again, buildings, they're always changing. They're never static, and they're subject to everyone's different whims, wants, and desires. This final one here I wanted to show is they actually really embraced the oddity of the design. And this is a liquor store in Central Phoenix. And they built up, rigged up their own structure here to sort of highlight it. But it's just beautiful to see the different way these buildings have changed over the years. Stuart Brand makes the point in the book that over the course of their lifetime, the amount of capital invested in the building can often be more in terms of renovation than the original construction of the building itself. And so, the renovation construction market is much larger even than the new construction market in our country. And that's just an interesting observation that, proves true that buildings are always in use and never static. He also makes the observation that places and spaces change at different aspects of places change at different rates. So if you start to think about the different layers of a building, some are changing at a slow pace and some are changing at a fast pace. So the interior of a building, the stuff like the furniture, is subject to changing day to day or month to month as people move things around. But the layout of walls and the space plan of a building may only change every couple of years as the tenant turns over. And then every 10 or 15 years, as new services are needed, those may change. And then on a multi-decadal basis, the skin or superstructure of a building may change if it's going to go through a significant remodel or maybe an adaptive reuse to completely change the exterior of a building. And then only once every whatever 50, 100 years are there site level things that induce a building to change. So to the extent that buildings are able to accommodate these different layers of change, they may be feasible to keep and reuse. And it's proven true in my experience that this different pacing of change, and I'm going to give an example of that when I talk about our hotel conversion in Phoenix. The second thing I've come to believe is that reusing buildings really can be good business. I think it's probably of interest to everyone on the call and here in the meetup today. But there really is an economic and business justification. It is case by case, and it's definitely contextual. And you have to do the due diligence to figure out if, in your case, it makes sense. But when it makes sense, it can make a great deal of sense, and it can be a home run. This is a photo of the sort of famous house that inspired the house in the movie Up. This is a holdout from a woman who didn't want to be part of a suburban mall assembly. And so they actually had to build the mall around her house. But the thing about adaptive reuse is that when you're making the analysis of whether it makes sense to you as a good business decision, it really hinges on analyzing the relationship between the existing land value, the value you can get out of the improvements, and the replacement value of the structure that you're inheriting, and then what your ultimate rehab costs are going to be, executing your value add strategy. So you have to ask yourself, can you get a low enough basis going in, and then really extract enough value from existing structure to justify that renovation and that change? And that's sort of a knotty, tough problem to figure out. Because there's risks in estimating things like construction costs. But if you really truly believe in the replacement value of some of the materials, architecture, design that you're inheriting, you can leverage that and make these things work out on a pro forma. Our company was born out of principles that came from the construction industry. So we have a perspective on buildings and properties that we see inherent value in structure, materials, finishes. In particular, in a high-cost construction market, we see a lot of value in footings and walls and other things. And to the extent that we can reuse those and leverage them, that's a positive contribution to the project. But whether or not a building is going to be reused, I think at the end of the day is made very early on. The decision is made very early on in the project because it's a function of your basis going in. And so whether you can perform a proper reuse project and not have to demo the building and build something larger, bigger, taller is based on your initial costs. So that decision is made on the buy. And I think that that's something that everyone needs to keep in mind. It's hard to overpay and then bail yourself out on the back end. And I like to think of adaptive reuse buildings as having the best kind of leverage. So you may have typical bank leverage, but you're also getting something with this that you're able to leverage in unexpected ways. And that's the fact that these buildings are emotionally resonant with people. They often have a story or history behind them, and that's endearing to neighbors, customers. You get a lot of marketing and goodwill out of those things. So I think that reusing buildings, it's often, you may find it easier to make it through tough neighborhood outreach processes and entitlement and regulatory processes, because there is some amount of people rooting for you. And if you especially do pop-up events or neighborhood outreach, the type of things I illustrated at Happy Motoring, you really do start to generate a lot of buzz and interest, and those people become proponents. And that's something that, it's really hard in this world and the fight for attention to get people to back you and come to a meeting and speak towards your project positively. Usually it's the negative opinions that come to those types of public meetings. But when it comes to preservation projects and adaptive reuse projects, that's an advantage that you're able to leverage if it's done well. And if you're able to execute a project well, I've seen in my experience, you create a very differentiated type of product. It's not a commodity product. It's not a commodity experience. It stands out from the urban fabric or the market and sub-market around you. And as a result, you can create a really great environment and situation for your operator, for your tenant. And if they're very good at what they do, then you really can just double down, and it can have very long tail outcomes with great upside. And what results is something that we like to think of as income producing art, is what we call it. And it's something that is, because it's not commodity and you're creating an experience, in a sense, you don't have to compete in the same way as commodity projects because you stand out from the crowd. And it results in trophy assets that have a real legacy. And I think it's the type of work that, yes, it's good business, but again, it's legacy work that I think a lot of people can be proud of. People are excited to be a part of. I think of one of the projects that Venue did in Central Phoenix. One of the principals, Lorenzo, his kids' handprints are in the concrete out front, right? So it's something that people can be proud of for generations, not just those involved, but the neighbors and the people around it. And if you have a good operator in there, everyone benefits from that. When we do pro formas, we like to talk about what we call as holistic ROI. So we do a typical prototypical analysis for maybe your cash on cash return or unlevered yield on cost, what have you. But we also do these qualitative analysis, and at the bottom of all the pro formas, we call out what is the social return, what is the emotional return, either for our team or others, what is the cultural return to the community. And we try to think through how are we representing those things in a project, because while they may not make it into the bottom line of a spreadsheet, typically, it is real, it is there, and we like to think about it. But while, I've also come to learn that while these things can have great upside, can be differentiated trophy assets, they are also inherently very risky, which is why they have the potential for return, because they come with greater risk. So these are not kind of like your core type of real estate strategy. These are value add or very entrepreneurial, very opportunistic strategies, often taking, again, very vacant, distressed assets, often having to re-entitle them or get variances and things in new ways that deviate from existing zoning. So you're going to have entitlement processes. There's a lot of risk with construction and understanding and bidding a project when you don't necessarily know what's behind walls or what's under a concrete slab. So you have to have contingencies and things in place. And then, of course, the other risk is with any operation is, can you get at least, and is that person a great operator? So I think the keys to kind of navigating that in my experience have been to know your strengths and partner and hire for the weaknesses you have. So as I said, our company, for example, Venue, has a construction background. So we have a very sort of builder mindset. And I think we have advantages when it comes to peeling back buildings and investigating them early on in the process and anticipating as much as possible how to design for unknowns or how to address details early on. But there are things we might be weak in that we need to hire for. And so we have a team built out of people with different skill sets. I bring a lot of the entitlement type of skill sets to the team and present at public meetings, get variances, that sort of thing. And that's based on a background in urban planning. So if you're going to build a team and get started in this business, they may not necessarily need to be an equity partner in your business, but you need to have great relationships with people that you can call on or hire for to get a project done. Definitely involve architect, engineer, GC early on in your due diligence period to try and anticipate as much as possible, maybe on small retainers. But that is invaluable information if that's not something that you can bring to the process. And then in my experience, it's been important because a lot of these are very custom type of construction projects to have great operators side by side with you, again, as early on as possible. I've not done a lot of reuse projects that were speculative and then lease up on the back end. It's usually having a partner, tenant, and an operator hand in hand with you to help build out the building to their needs in a build to suit sort of way. And that has been important in my experience. And having a person who can operate well, market well, has great customer service. I mean, at the end of the day, after the building is quote unquote finished, they're the one who runs with it, and you're going to need that no matter what. The third and final thing is it's not an easy business. Adaptive reuse is a full contact sport. You know, everything in real estate is risky, but these are especially so. They can be emotionally challenging. You can suffer from lack of motivation, or you're feeling like I'm constantly being assailed by problems, constantly having to tackle unknowns. And you really just have to push through it, believe in it, and be willing to take the hits. Mike Tyson has a great quote that everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. And these projects are just like that. They're the type of thing that you're going to get punched in the mouth. And you got to know that going in. One of my favorite quotes from an adaptive reuse developer, they're based in Chicago, Bohm Development. One of their principals said about a project in Arizona, "We know we're going to spit blood on this one. That's what we signed up for." And that's the type of mentality and mindset, you know, the tenacious kind of mindset, the entrepreneurial mindset you have to have. You have to believe in getting it done, because there are going to be a lot of people that don't believe. There'll be a lot of people that don't see a vision of how you can take an abandoned building in a disinvested neighborhood and bring it new life, because they haven't seen anyone do otherwise. So you've got to prove a lot of people wrong. So you got to ask yourself, you know, do you believe in something that others don't? And not only that, but are you willing to push through? And do you see enough of a return on what we call return on brain damage to run the marathon to the finish? And those are important questions. And not everyone may answer yes to those, or they may answer yes on some projects, but not others. And that's fine, but it's just a matter of doing that analysis up front. Again, it's important to get end user operator input as soon as possible. And then just be as ready as you can for the fact that these are going to be iterative designs. You're going to have unforeseen conditions, so contingencies, and a builder who has that experience is important. And then, you know, you're going to have lots of conversations about random things where old and new meet, like flashing and waterproofing. So be ready for multi-hour long site walks and conversations about riveting topics like that. And then also important, set your partner and investor expectations early. You know, the people have to understand and have the perspective that you can't control everything. There will be unknowns, but your role is to manage that on their behalf, and you're going to do so, you know, responsibly. People just need to know that you're aware that it's going to happen. And, you know, to the extent that you can get investors and partners who have some perspective on that, and that's great, because they'll be less worried when those things come up. But as the developer, there will be times too on long projects and reuse that people may be suffering from a lack of motivation. They might just feel like there's problems every day. So you really have to be the positive force who's there, demanding that everyone is pursuing excellence, but also encouraging people. There's a reason, there's a vision why we're here working together as a team. We are capable of doing it. You're the best of the best, and pushing through to the finish line. One other project I wanted to bring up is an adaptive reuse project that we did here in Phoenix with VENTURE. So Venue has three principals: John Kitchell, Beatrice Kitchell, Lorenzo Perez. It was started in 2008, heading into the great financial crisis, to take advantage of buying opportunities in the downturn. And over the last decades, built a great track record of reuse. And a lot of that culminated in the last couple of years with this larger scale project that we took on as a joint venture with a multi-generational larger developer in Phoenix. But we brought to bear kind of the execution, construction, and design experience in the joint venture. But this project took two late 50s, early 60s office buildings on Camelback Road in Phoenix and converted them to a 79-room boutique hotel with food, beverage, and a pool. This is a photo of the first building that was built in 1958. Very cool mid-century style with kind of a waffle penthouse roof line. John and Lorenzo had this building in the early 2010s, and then eventually through partnership, we're able to gain access to the neighboring building and reparcel them into one property. So two office buildings, which historically were actually built by the same developer in Phoenix, and then redeveloped by the same developer, 60 years later. So it's now called the Rise Uptown Hotel at 400 West Camelback. This is a before photo of those two mid-century office buildings, different in design from each other, but both indicative of different trends in that era. It's largely dominated by parking because at that time, that's what mattered to tenants in the late 50s and 60s, was pulling up to your office out front. They advertised for that. This is how it looks today, converted. So you can see we were able to reduce parking count quite a bit because this now exists in a TOD overlay area. And we were able to infill new food, beverage, amenities, and pool. So a series of new construction pad buildings, if you will. And then the two office buildings converted to a boutique hotel. The office suites were originally very much like small office, mom and pop, small business operators. So they were small floor plates of, let's say, 300 square foot each. Over time, they'd been mixed up, demised, cut up, combined. But we went through an extensive demo process. And fortuitously, the floor plate kind of 300 some square feet of the original office suite was lined up quite well to the size of a standard boutique hotel room these days, so 320 square feet or so. They laid out quite well. We changed circulation and all kinds of other things, but these were a complete gut, complete rehab, all new systems, all new infrastructure, all new stormwater underground, landscaping. It's kind of a soup to nuts redo. What we kept were really the exterior skins and some of the internal demising walls. It was really the architecture of the story that was reused. And I just wanted to bring up the Stewart Brand's shearing layers again, because what the impetus for what allowed this building to change so drastically, this site, was that there was a major change in the site level context, which is in the late 2000s, the light rail was installed in Phoenix. And so that level of investment by the city and regional governments resulted in enough change in the market that it made sense to pursue a huge kind of site level change in this project, which came 60 years after these buildings were built. This is some aerials. This is before and progress towards after. The landscaping and all that, if you're ever here in Phoenix, it's just coming in really lush and blooming well. It's a gorgeous property. I'm really proud to have been a part of that one. And if you're ever in Phoenix and you want to stay at a cool boutique hotel located in town near great restaurants, Rise Uptown Hotel is a place to be. As I said, though, there's a lot of challenges. This is just a short laundry list of the types of things that we had to go through. A lot of entitlement work. In my experience, there's not really buy right adaptive reuse redevelopment projects, you typically need some amount of zoning modification. And that was true on this. A lot of variances for the pool, for the buildings, for the signage, use permits, where we had to take back a piece of city right of way from the light rail, remnant light rail land that they no longer needed, but we needed along the sidewalk. It was replatted, readdressed, and we also added historic preservation zoning overlay that was voluntary. And the reason for that is because one, we wanted to pursue historic tax credits, and two, the historic preservation zoning allowed us to access the international existing building code, which is different than just the IBC building code, and provide some amount of relief for things like handrails and some of the existing conditions, elevators. And that's an interesting strategy. Be happy to talk more about that. But when it comes to reuse, sometimes the existing building code is a great way to go. Final thing, what I'm most proud of on this project is we found some old photos and magazines of the original. They had a big neon sign out front for Don Woods Realty. He had his office in the penthouse. We were able to recreate that neon sign, and the penthouse is now the Don Woods rooftop bar. So very cool. This is a photo of that neon sign today. It's a beautiful addition to the property. Took like 7 variances to get, as you can imagine. So definitely not legal in a normal signage code, but totally worth it. So that's all I have today. But my question to everyone is, who's ready to take that somebody auto building in your neighborhood and go through the brain damage of getting it repositioned?
Awesome.
And then I'm happy to take questions, or we have a discussion and chat more.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Yeah. If you want to stop sharing your screen too, and then we'll just go open discussion. First off, thank you so much for that presentation. I think for a lot of people, especially in the commercial space, have an interest in this because there's 2 ways to do it, right? You can do the ground up development route where you buy a parcel of land and build something from scratch. And then also you can incorporate, existing structures to create something unique and preserve something, in particular, if it has a historic component to it that has, that a lot of the neighborhood's value. I mean, that in and of itself can be of extreme value to people in the neighborhood. So that's awesome.
Yeah, I think a lot of what I've learned is there are developers who come to a property with the mindset of it being land, and there are developers who come to a property with the mindset of it being a building. And it's 2 very different mindsets.
For sure. So yeah, what we'll go ahead and do is we'll open it now up to Q&A. So if you guys are watching this on Zoom, feel free to chime away in the chat box. And then if you guys are watching this on Facebook or other media platforms, feel free to chime away as well. And I'll be checking these mediums. So Bruce has a question.
Yeah, I thought what wonderful reconstruction you've done, reuse. I'm so impressed. I was wondering that the use of the gas station.
Yes.
Didn't you have to worry about digging up those tanks and getting rid of them?
We did. Yeah. We did have to worry about that. Yes, it's a very good question, because I think the reason why it was sitting out there on the market so long is probably, especially the perception of that was keeping people from even investigating. But it turns out that in the case of that property, the guy who owned it and was needing to sell it actually owned an environmental cleanup company, and his whole business strategy is he bought DEP listed properties or whatever, and awarded himself the contract to clean them up. So it had gone through a process and was already in the phase 2 or whatever they call it.
Thank you. That's that's how, because I was always worried about that as far as not to invest in a gas station, although they would be perfect. I did to convert 2 homes. One from the 50s, old Bedford stone, very well built, to an orthodontic office. So they're tri-level to an orthodontic office.
That's cool.
And we converted a Victorian home into a bakery and dessert cafe. But let me tell you, talk about getting punched in the mouth. I think I lost a couple teeth too, because everything from getting variance or dealing with the church in the backyard that, to get their approval. I mean, it
Yeah.
was quite an ordeal. And by the way, I'm not in real estate. I'm an orthodontist. So
I love that.
and this is my daughter's bakery. So, but I didn't want to build from scratch. It was great properties, good land at good locations. And that's what's giving me my retirement income now is my rental.
That's beautiful.
So,
It sounds like you're not just an orthodontist, but you're an entrepreneur to me.
not so great, but I'll try.
Well,
Thank you.
we're all in some level trying to get better. But what market was this in?
Louisville,
city?
Kentucky. Louisville, Kentucky.
Louisville. All right, right on.
That's where I'm at.
Hometown crowd here. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's
there's
really
some,
cool.
yeah.
And if you had to do a bakery and all that, then you also had to do the commercial kitchen and things. That's always intense to retroactively put
Right.
into any building,
Especially-
let alone a home.
It's in Clifton, so it's a historic neighborhood, which made it even harder.
Ah, yeah. Did you get credits, or did you pursue historic credits?
Actually, no, but I didn't know anything about it. Probably, is it still possible?
I don't want to definitively say no and be wrong, but it might be tough. I know that actually Arizona's historic preservation officer is on the call. And I know that she made a comment too. If a building's over 50 years old, I want to shout out Catherine Leonard, who runs SHPO in Arizona. Over 50 years of age, contact your state historic preservation office. I would back that and say, definitely true. They need to be part of your due diligence and outreach early on, because you may have access to resources that you don't even realize, as we just touched on with Bruce.
Sure. And
Thank
it
you.
looks like Catherine clarifies. You said, hey there, yes, credits can be retroactive, but difficult to attain. So it could be something you look into. Again, I would imagine, I know there's different historic neighborhoods. I have a property in Old Louisville, which is like a, historic neighborhood here in Louisville. And, there are opportunities for historic tax credits, but from my understanding, it was related to the redevelopment of a building, and you have to put in a certain amount in order to get a certain amount of credits. But I'm also not an expert in it. So contacting someone locally to get a better feel for those tax credits could be a benefit for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
So, of course. So Brandon actually had a question. He said, interested to hear how you develop your limited partner investment list. How do you market to interested partners? And then Brett, you'll be next.
So I've seen it in two different cases. First in Tallahassee. This was a smaller project. We initially bought that building. It was a different time in the market, and there's very much a bias against that neighborhood. And it was an old gas station. So we bought that for 110,000. So we had to scrounge up whatever, 20 or 30,000 between three people. And then we did a construction loan and had to put up a little more equity when we did that. And then eventually converted both the initial loan and construction loan into a long-term, took it out with long-term financing. In our case there, it was a mix of friends and family money and people in our professional network. We were able to do that because I think partly we had a lot of relationships to white collar professionals in town via the business incubator and getting involved in the startup community there. So not necessarily the entrepreneurs starting the projects or starting the companies, but all the people who were ancillary to that, like the accountants, lawyers, et cetera, that were wealth managers or whatever, who were a part of that ecosystem on the edges. So that might be one way to get involved in some of those types of meetups in your community and meeting, the guy who owns the insurance agency or the interested orthodontist, who's enough of an entrepreneur to show up at those types of things. So that was helpful to us, mix of friends and family money. It was smaller scale and entry level. I definitely recommend that people start small. Your first project should not be your magnum opus, biggest, it's not your first project is not going to be your life's work, and it doesn't need to be. You need to build up small and incrementally, even if that means starting with, converting your backyard garage to a ADU unit, whatever you can do to prove track record, and then show that off through social media and relationships to as many people as possible. And then in the case of venue stuff, which is more capital intensive, it's definitely scaled up over time. They started small with just converting one retail 1940s retail strip to a restaurant. But even that's, a few million in construction costs. That was a mixture of friends, family, close people who worked. These are people who had couple decades of experience working in real estate and construction, again, mostly through the construction route. But via that, they knew a handful of higher net worth, very successful subcontractors, for one, electricians and plumbers, people who've built big companies. Those people are enough in the industry. They have good perspective. They want to invest in buildings. They also understand the perils of construction, so they're great partners to have. And they may even use their companies, to help build it out. And then they're much more of a partnership that way. So there's a mix of, high net worth, friends, family there, but again, professional contacts who they worked with for a while and gained trust in.
Oh, for sure. That's a great response. Yeah. And I think as you start building, like you said, a reputation, you get one small project under your belt and you start showcasing that on, like you said, social media, start building that personal brand pertaining to, redevelopment. That's, I'm assuming, where, a lot more contacts start coming down the pike. So,
I
but
know
yeah, starting small.
You have to have a
starting
long-term perspective, and
Mm-hmm.
whatever, like they say, play long-term games with long-term people. And, you see things on social media, there's so much pressure to think like I'm not keeping up or whatever, but it's not true. Everyone starts where they start and they have what they have, and it takes time to build. So.
For sure. So Brett, I think, had the next question.
Yep.
I'll let him. Yep.
Appreciate it. Lucas, thanks for
Hey man,
the great presentation. Love seeing you highlight that Happy Motoring project. It's actually one of the first projects I saw that really showed how you can take that incremental development and make a difference in an area and create a sense of community somewhere that didn't have it. My question's more along the lines of hurdles as far as on the regulatory process. Down here, I'm in Jupiter and worked with who's now become a really good friend of mine. He bought a 1924 house that was built by a pioneer family of Jupiter, one of the original settlers and original pioneers of a church down the street. And no one really knew the history of it until he bought it, turned into a drug house and a brothel, and he painted it white and cleaned up all the landscaping. And I mean, it's a beautiful property right now. And then next door was an old furniture store. But over the years, as zoning came about, those were all zoned residential properties. And when he bought it, the furniture store next door was kind of grandfathered in as a commercial use. Right. But the residential house, we had to pretty much bang our heads against the wall dealing with our local municipality to rewrite the zoning code to allow the adaptive reuse of residential properties for a commercial use within a residential district. And they really tied us down to, they really just came down to, they didn't want a commercial property in a historic house in the middle of a neighborhood. It had to be on kind of a more or less an arterial street with all these other different requirements and whatnot. So I mean, that was a hurdle. And then now, obviously, over the years, we don't have many historic structures. So now going through and him doing the adaptive reuse and dealing with our building department and us almost having to do the research to say, no, these codes are applicable, those codes aren't. I was just curious if you ran into anything that was similar to kind of teach the professionals, like, no, this is actually what we're allowed to do.
I think in varying ways that I've had that experience, yes. So it's always been, I think it's always true that no one's going to be an advocate for your project like you. And, you're one of dozens, as you know, working in the city government itself, that, they have a macro level view, and there's a ton of projects on their plate, and they're just trying to get them throughput as much as possible. So, especially now when the market is so busy, and you get such little amount of time and attention, yeah, you definitely have to have done your own research, and be an advocate for yourself. We've had to do that on many occasions. Just I guess at a high level, without getting into too much of it, what we've found really useful is, again, you have to be positive and constructive with staff. You want them on your side and to be advocates for you. So, going in berating people, telling them they don't know what they're doing with their job, that's not very helpful behavior. Probably in the long term is not going to get you a good reputation. Obviously, I know you know that, but so you have to go in with the positive, constructive attitude. And I think you constantly have to ask why. What is the rationale? Why is that the case? And keep digging. So if someone gives you a dead end, ask why, and just keep retreating back to, well, if we were going to do this, let's suspend reality for a minute. If we were going to do this, how could we do it? And get them to start to sort of ideate with you about, well, I guess you could maybe park off the rear from the alley if you got a variance for maneuvering in the right of way or whatever. You're like, okay, well, it sounds like I might need a variance for maneuvering in the right of way. They may not offer that up to you at first blush. So I think you constantly have to be your own advocate and do that kind of digging. Yes, that's always going to be true. And as I said, these projects are almost never by right. When you go through that change of use, the structure was not built for what you're putting in. And depending on its level of intensity, may require substantial regulatory change, unfortunately.
Yeah, it was almost like speaking another language to them going in there with this project. And it's like, look to West Palm, look to, New York, Boston, adaptive reuse isn't a new concept, but
no, it's as old as buildings are.
Exactly. Yeah. I think you hit on it perfectly. That saying you had at the beginning, the buildings have double reality or whatever that was. I mean, that's the truth. And, that's, to me, that's what makes cities and towns unique, right? You're preserving the history and you're allowing people to walk through a building.
Yes.
Having a different use, but you're still telling the story and the history, whether it's through the architecture or the person that built it or the person that lived there.
Yeah.
So,
that's why I love it.
Definitely appreciate it. And anyone that's on the call, if anyone comes down to Jupiter, feel free to reach out. We'd love to show you the project, and hopefully our restaurant's opening next month.
Great, man. That's awesome.
That's awesome. Really. Yeah. And I like the fact that you said, asking those questions of individuals at the planning and zoning and all these other entities which you're needing to partner with in order to get the project done. Because a lot of times, like I know we talked about this before, Lucas, like sometimes you just don't know what questions to ask. So you're just trying to go through the process of saying, okay, well, if I want to do this, how can we go about doing this? Again, they may not offer it up right off the bat, but at least it gets you down the path of saying, okay, you need to do this, you need to do this. And it's like, okay, well, let me go do some research to figure out what that actually means and just take initiative towards getting that project done. And, again, if this is the first time you doing something like this, I imagine it's can be an overwhelming process, but if you're willing to put in the work and try to get things done, then we can. Yep. So we'll go ahead and
I see a couple other real quick. I think I could hit some of these very quickly in the chat.
Yeah, we'll have two more questions and then we'll go ahead and wrap up because I know everyone's time's valuable. So I want to make sure we're keeping on time.
Well, I see. What was the name of the firm you mentioned regarding the gas station incremental something? I mentioned the Incremental Development Alliance. I'm not sure if that's what it was, but that's a group that teaches people how to be small scale developers and get started. They do pop-up workshops around the country, some of them now virtual. You can Google them. Another question, what comes first, tenant lease up to rehab or attract tenant? Everything's case by case. You could do either. People do speculative reuse projects. In my experience, the successful ones that I've been a part of, you have your tenants early on as partners. You're building to suit with them, alongside them. They may even be investors or partners in some cases. I would favor that more than speculative. Try to lease up after, or at least a substantial portion of your building with your anchor in hand, and then maybe you're leasing up, a few of the rooms and building parts of the building that you couldn't get done. You didn't have a tenant for early on.
Yeah, and banks like that better too. They like the security of knowing that you have a lease up. You have at least a portion, if not the majority of the building leased up before you start construction. Because a lot of times financing is the hurdle. You got, especially starting out, you got to convince these lenders that, they're, by them taking this quote unquote risk with you, it is
That's a great
worthwhile.
Point. I'm glad you said that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead. And then I think the last question was with Holly. She mentioned, what website, places, conferences do you go for networking, getting resources, and learning about this concept?
I'm involved in APA, American Planning Association, that sometimes touches on this. The historic preservation world sometimes touches on this as well. Probably more applicable than APA in some cases, but those are both great. Those all have their own conferences, whatnot. The Incremental Development Alliance definitely touches on this, and I would talk to them. And then the other thing that we're a part of that one of our principals, Lorenzo, has been very instrumental in is the ULI Small Scale Development Council. It's a small group of small to mid-scale developers across the country. Some of them with very impressive track records, and just a great group. They get together regularly. They host virtual stuff, but also conference. And they just put out a book. The guy who runs that, Jim Hyde, put out a book called Building Small, which I would recommend to anyone. Great book. We happen to be featured in that book as one of some case studies, which get into the nitty gritty of deal structure on one of our projects. So that's a fun one, fun read for someone who wants to gain some perspective.
Yeah. And for those of you guys who are listening on YouTube or the podcast, we'll go ahead and include the link to that book below so you guys can see it as well.
Awesome.
Well, Lucas, thank you so much for stopping by today. We really do appreciate all the insights you did provide.
Yeah,
again, like I said before, adaptive reuse is something that a lot of people that are in the commercial real estate industry or have interest in for that exact reason that, you can take something that had been abandoned or left to just deteriorate and bring it new life and maintain some of the historical aspects, in particular if you're located in some of these cities that do have a history, like Louisville, even Phoenix, back in the 50s, like you were referencing with the Circle K. So thank you again so much. As far as like people wanting to get in contact with you and learn a little bit more about you, maybe want to do business with you in the future, how exactly do they do that?
Well, VENTUREProjects.com, of course, for our company. You can email me at Lucas, Lucas, at VENTUREProjects.com. And then I'm most active on Twitter at Urbanist, Urbanist with no A. So that's what was available. That's what I am.
Sure. Yeah. And we'll go ahead and include that in the show description below. So if you guys are listening to this on a podcast format, I'll be in the description. If you guys are watching this on YouTube, it'll as well be in the description. So awesome. Thank you again so much,
Thanks
Lucas.
Thank you all. Thanks everyone.
Oh, of course. Thank you all for stopping by. We really appreciate you guys supporting the meetup and being involved, and we'll see you all next time.
Awesome. Bye all.
See you guys.